this?
Right from the beginning of development, we intended to feature a variety of visually distinct Zen flora and fauna in Half Life Alyx. But we didn't yet know how these visual elements would be used to craft interesting gameplay. Referred to internally as Zen clams, the Zen plants you would see here were originally built to add visual flavor to the world and were only lightly interactive. They would track the player's head and hands and would close tight if the player got too close. When we began working on Jeff, we wanted to find surprising new ways to use sound as a core gameplay mechanic. In particular, we wanted to make players wary of the environment around them. We realized we could use the Zen clams as a type of noise hazard by having them repeatedly snap open and shut when approached by the player. We had already placed these clams in earlier parts of the game, which meant that players would reach the distillery with an understanding of how they functioned. The introduction of Jeff changed the player's relationship with the Zen clams, as they went from being harmless but annoying to a dangerous hazard that players would need to take care to avoid.
Hey, you with the blood on you. You with the blood. I got a little situation here.
Yeah, you sure do.
You don't happen to have a gun on you, do you? Yeah, look at that. It's a nice. Thanks.
What the hell was that?
Oh, that's Jeff.
Jeff?
Oh, don't worry. You can't see. Here's just fine, though. Got an ear like Mozart.
Who?
All right, now let me help you out. All right, see you on the other side, Keyboard. And keep your voice down.
Early versions of the distillery explored a variety of methods for subtlety, teaching players how Jeff works without any explicit exposition. Though some of the training techniques were quite successful, anything less than a complete understanding of Jeff's behavior resulted in players bungling their way through this section of the game and having a terrible time doing it. Eventually, we determined that explicit training was necessary, and that's where the character of Larry came in. Larry acts as a gate, delivering critical information about Jeff's behavior before allowing the player to proceed. It's a dense learning environment and a delicate balancing act, ensuring that we deliver the rules of Jeff while still making Larry an interesting character. To spread out the exposition, you'll notice that it's distributed over a few different story beats as Larry first introduces Jeff, then demonstrates Jeff's predictable reaction to a breaking bottle, and finally explains that the player can prevent their own coughing on Zen spores by covering their mouth.
See? He's totally unpredictable. But he will rip your arms off if he finds you. Hey, those things are nasty. You gotta cover your mouth.
Got it, thanks.
Hey, I almost forgot. What's your name?
Alex. Alex Vance.
Hey, Alex, I'm Larry. Nice to meet you. Try not to get killed. Nice helmet, by the way.
Even though Larry instructs the player on the basics of how Jeff works, we found that we needed to let players test those rules without having Jeff in their immediate personal space. If we made players first interact with Jeff face to face, they often fell to pieces and forgot the rules. They would die over and over again, and their fear of Jeff would quickly turn into frustration and annoyance. This area was created to serve as a training playground, where players can observe Jeff reacting to various sounds while remaining safe from his attacks. It contains many of the elements that are encountered throughout the rest of the level, including some falling bottles, a padlock that needs to be shot, and various types of Zen plants. Jeff remains close enough to feel threatening, but he cannot attack the player. Players can spend as much time here as they need to, and move on when they feel like they've got a good grip on how Jeff works.
Jeff's character design went through several significant revisions over the course of development. Just by looking at him, we wanted players to understand certain things about the character. Our first priority was to communicate his blindness. Second, we wanted the character to feel physically imposing. After all, the entire concept of Jeff had grown out of our observation that just being close to a character in VR could make for a powerful experience. Finally, we wanted players to understand the blind zombie's behavioural state at a glance. Is he feeling angry? Did he just hear something and is feeling curious? And so on. The first design that we modelled and animated was a sort of combine worker robot. The robot's face featured a holographic display that could flip between different icons that represented its state. A large piece of rebar jutted out of the back of the robot's head, sparking electricity and spewing smoke. This was meant to demonstrate that its visual sensors were impaired, making it blind. We made the robot tall and hulking. It looked heavy, unpredictable and dangerous. However, player reactions to this robotic design showed that it had problems. Players would initially focus on the head's holographic display. Parsing the face and understanding the meaning of the icons proved too challenging for players, and even worse, this element distracted from the rebar poking through the robot's head and their understanding that it was blind. Players found the robot imposing, but we weren't getting the deeply visceral reaction of fear that was desired. A trip back to the drawing board landed us with the more organic character you see in front of you. Drawing inspiration from the idea of coal miners succumbing to the black lung, we focused on the concept of a member of the Combine's Zen cleanup crew that had succumbed to the Zen infection. This gave us the visceral reaction from players which we were looking for. A human face is still visible, but the eyes are clearly decayed, communicating blindness. The organic nature of this design allowed us to lean more heavily on audio to feed back the behavioural state, with animalistic grunts and roars that came to include more human-sounding elements over time.
Hey, Alex! Oh, there you are. Can you hear me?
More or less. You're breaking up.
I think you're still in the distillery.
I made a friend named Jeff.
Well, that's great. We can take all the help we can get.
Yeah, we're not really close.
Listen, there should be a big tunnel-sized plug in the floor there somewhere. That's gonna be...
The tunnel out of here?
correct. You get it open, I'll figure out where it leads.
Since the entire premise of Jeff hinged on keeping Jeff and the player in close proximity to each other, the distillery map was constructed as a series of chambers connected by one-way transitions. Early on, we used two techniques in concert to keep Jeff and the player together throughout the level. First, each new area was gated with a special locked door. These took the form of impenetrable Zen membranes that only Jeff could tear through. The player would lure Jeff to the membrane using sound, and Jeff would break it open so that both Jeff and the player could proceed. We had always had a goal of having players describe Jeff in adversarial terms, as a constant pursuer or a thorn in their side. The problem with the Zen membrane concept was that it led to players describing Jeff as a useful tool, or worse, an angry co-op partner, rather than something they feared. Another way that we would keep Jeff and the player together was via the use of one-way drops. Jeff would fall off catwalks, platforms, and ladders into each new area. These drops functioned as intended, but just like the Zen membranes, elicited an undesirable reaction from players, especially when repeated multiple times. Watching Jeff do these pratfalls left players feeling like he was less dangerous. They felt sorry for him, and even laughed at him. Eventually, we realized that we could use combined force fields, which the player cannot pass through, as a way to create one-way doors. These force fields allowed Jeff to move through them, but required the player to follow via another one-way path. This allowed us to build thresholds where Jeff and the player could both move forward while eliminating the awkwardness of the Zen membranes and avoiding the repeated falls that had previously made Jeff look so clumsy. Combined force fields also had a few other benefits. For one, they gave Jeff a convenient way to take a backstage route that is inaccessible to the player, like the one at the bottom of this ladder.
Nicely done.
Creating an experience with such a heavy focus on audio presented some unique design problems. The primary challenge was determining which sounds Jeff should be able to hear and making sure that players understood the rules. Half Life Alyx contains a vast array of physics objects. However, through playtesting we found it best to use only a small set of them in the distillery. We needed to pay close attention to each object that we did include, particularly to audio design for collisions between the object and the various surface types used in the distillery. It was important that what players heard matched their expectations for how Jeff would react. In early testing, we would find individual cases where players would say things like, "I don't know why Jeff got angry," or "I would have expected that noise to attract Jeff." Over time, we identified these cases of confusion and addressed them one by one. It was vital that players always be able to identify the cause and effect of a noise that might attract Jeff. Failing this meant players were left feeling like Jeff acted randomly and they'd grow frustrated. Some experiments failed in this area. At one point, parts of the level were littered with piles of broken glass that would make noise if the player walked or teleported over them. Few players would notice the broken glass and were then surprised when Jeff attacked, so this concept was cut to avoid confusion. We had to be wary of the opposite case too, where players would expect purely aesthetic elements to present a noise hazard. For example, at one point we had placed shallow pools of water seeping in among the floor tiles. It looked really cool, but it confused some of our playtesters who thought that the sound of their footsteps splashing through these puddles would be audible to Jeff, even though we never intended that to be the case.
And there we go. What the hell is that?
That's Jeff. Keep your voice down.
Oh, okay. Right, I don't like Jeff.
Figuring out how to end the player's journey through the distillery involved a lot of discussion about how players would ultimately end up feeling about Jeff. Observing playtests told us that most players simply wanted him dead, usually from the moment they met him, but there were some who felt kind of sorry for him and didn't necessarily want to see him killed. Our first version of the ending involved the player's actions unintentionally resulting in Jeff being attacked and dragged away by antlions. Part of the goal was to demonstrate that the antlions are even more powerful than Jeff, to amp up the tension just before players have to square off against antlions themselves. This ending left players feeling a little empty. They felt detached from Jeff's demise and wanted to be more directly involved. Dark stuff, to be sure. Plus, we weren't really servicing those players who felt sorry for Jeff and didn't necessarily want to see him killed. There were other problems too. The antlion attack felt random to many players, which reduced its impact. And because Jeff presumably died off-screen, players were left without a sense of closure. This prevented players from being able to switch gears and settle in for their encounter with the antlions. The trash compactor was a solution to these problems. It gave players the opportunity to decide Jeff's fate and be left with a sense of closure whether they decided to squash him or just leave him imprisoned. Even so, it has to be admitted that most players seem to crush Jeff with zero hesitation.
That tunnel heads to the vault.
Great. Also, little heads up. I think the tunnel is full of antlions. Just in case I cut out permanently.
Antlions.
Yeah, you know, aliens with stabby legs.
Oh, yes, and very small, like ants.
No.
Like tiny little lions.
No, that's not them. These ones are pretty dangerous.
Right, well, whatever they are, they're down that tunnel.
Yep. Off I go.